ready to get started. Just for those of you who didn't quite gotten the updated message or were confused, our original speaker for this month had to cancel because of the COVID exposure thing. So hopefully his was going to be on the Mullen Monuments. Hopefully we'll get him rescheduled for a future month. Meanwhile, these guys previously had to cancel for sickness, and we got them rescheduled for this, so it really worked out. So they're going to introduce themselves and their program, but it's Kristjana and Emma from Fort. You may remember last year they did a talk on the Japanese internment. Kristjana gave a talk back in February for Black History Month about the Bicycle Corps. And friends, mentors.
Thanks, Maria.
I think that works as an intro. And then just real quick, next month we are doing Trader Outs Prior to Colonization with Jessica Bush, who is one of the state historians, so that will be very fun. So cool. Show up for that.
All right, we'll see if I got this one on right and enough and all that stuff. So my name is Kristjana. I'm the education director at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, so I'm in charge of all of the school programming and public programs and that stuff. And this is, sorry.
Second. There we go. Okay, so I'm Emma Selfors. I'm the curator over at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. I handle our collection of over 50,000 objects, as well as do all of the temporary exhibits that are on display for various amounts of time. And this program is indeed inspired by one of said temporary exhibits, and we'll talk about that a bit at the end of our presentation.
So what we're going to be talking about today is the Civilian Conservation Corps and how Fort Missoula served as a starting point for a lot of the Civilian Conservation Corps folks who came out to the West. So without further ado, we will jump on in here, and I'll see if I remember what I put in this program. I went the wrong way. See, we are starting off well. Okay, so this is our contact information, but you can always get a hold of us through the museum or through our website. And so Fort Missoula and the CCC. But what got us here? So the Civilian Conservation Corps, we'll talk more about what it was, but it was one of the programs through the New Deal that put people to work in conservation and recreation programs. But the reason why we got a CCC was because of what life was like in the 1930s. And so most of you folks are history buffs, so you probably have a good understanding of the basics of the Depression. But by the time 1933 happened, when the Civilian Conservation Corps was put into place, we had the stock market crash of 1929, combined with some maybe bad economic policies, and then also 150 years of farming in the United States that wasn't informed by the kind of agricultural science that we know and love today. So those things combined, maybe you guys are familiar with the Dorothea Lange photo over there of the migrant mama, and then we have some folks that are there protesting. Let me see here. So it was a very drastic change from the 1920s, where we had the opulence post-World War I, and we call it the jazz era. Think about all of that spending. And then within 10 years, we had soup lines and people jumping on railroad cars trying to find work across the country. So we had that stock market crash, and then the Dust Bowl. So people talk about seeing Kansas fly right by their window because there was so much topsoil that was removed just by erosion at the time. So by 1932, 1 out of every 4 workers in the United States were unemployed. That's about 13 million people, and people estimate that it was actually much more than that, because by the time we were counting these things, many people had kind of given up on work. We had the widespread erosion of farmland, and this is one of Emma's great little facts here. The amount of soil lost each year during this period was enough to fill a series of boxcars that could wrap around the earth 7 times. So that's just a massive quantity of topsoil, which made farming for people who had been farming for generations impossible. And there were also small riots and hunger marches. So I think it's easy for us 90 years later to forget the sort of amount of turmoil that our country was facing back in 1932. So that set up the stage for Franklin Delano Roosevelt to set up the New Deal. So he campaigned on this series of projects that would be set up as sort of safety nets for people in a way that we hadn't done in our country up to this point. Some people like to call it the alphabet soup because we had the CCC and the WRA, and we'll get through a bunch more of those as we go. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was actually established within the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. There were about 15 programs in this New Deal that were established in that first 100 days. Not all of them were winners, but the CCC ended up being one of the ones that was more successful. Each person who joined the CCC was paid $30 a month. 25 of that would go back to their families. So it helped the person who was working, but then also their families wherever that hometown was. And that $5 they would spend in the camp area. So if they were from, say, New Jersey and they came out to Montana, some of that money gets spent here. A lot of it goes back to support their families. Folks got training on projects that we'll talk about later to do with conservation or building. And eventually they discovered that they needed basic things like literacy and education, and that all came out as a part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was only for men, but there were some programs for women that we'll get into later. And by the end of the 9-year CCC program, about 3 million men were enrolled in the CCC, or had been enrolled. So today we're going to talk about Montana, but if you're interested in learning more about all of the camps that were across the country, you could check out ccclegacy.org. On to you.
All right. So Kristjana very nicely set the scene here. So stock market crash, depression, folks were really having a rough go. And the same goes for Fort Missoula, was going through quite a few changes at this point in time. So there was actually discussion in the late 1920s, early 1930s of actually closing Fort Missoula, which had previously been a fort since 1870. 77, I was close enough. And there was even a discussion about turning it into a tuberculosis hospital for Native Americans at one point, which was a fact I did not know prior to learning this. So as this kind of continued to happen, basically Fort Missoula became the fort without a purpose. Didn't have much going on, and all of a sudden it got tapped to become a center of intake, supply, and deployment as the new Northwest Regional District Headquarters Detachment. So that is the DHD, in case that pops up later. District Headquarters Detachment for the Civilian Conservation Corps. So yeah, you can see here there was even newspaper discussion about, oh, are we going to be able to keep the fort here? Will it have to go away? That lovely little logo there, as well as applicants were starting as quickly as possible to be applied and just rolled right into the program. So I have my notes here that on April 5th, 1933, Major Walter Root, who you can see right there, he was the highest ranking officer at Fort Missoula at the time. He got a call to begin preparations to set up this district headquarters detachment. Basically, this meant that they needed to set up tents and latrines for 250 men within 18 days. So by April 18th, they were already ready for 250 men to start arriving. And luckily, they had a little bit of time because the first trainload of boys from New York, there were 189 of them in that first truckload. They didn't arrive until June 1st, so a little bit more time than just those 18 days, but boy, were they ready. So you can see right here, these are actually photos of Fort Missoula as they had set up those tents and training areas, getting ready. Some folks can actually recognize the buildings in the back. I am not as good. That might be the post hospital right there in the corner.
And then you see Heritage Hall, and then to the right is T1 before they changed it.
Before they brought over the...
before they scooted it back and took the end off and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so Fort Missoula looked pretty different at this point in time. And within that first year's summer, 6,500 men came through Fort Missoula, and they were coming by the hundreds. So it really wasn't a surprise to see anywhere between 400 to 500 men on Fort Missoula's grounds during this time. And they got started right away. So as you can see there, that article of the conservation crews were right about to get started, and they did indeed start in Rattlesnake Valley as one of their first projects. So basically, the reason that Fort Missoula was chosen was also because all of this lovely infrastructure already existed, including the management under the Army. So the Army was really the only branch of the government that was going to be able to handle the hundreds and thousands of men who were going to be transferred from one place to another, getting trained to do various tasks, getting payments, getting supplies, getting equipment. The Army is well equipped for something like that. So we already did have the Army here, obviously, at Fort Missoula, and that was indeed the 4th Infantry. So we do have a lovely 4th Infantryman who, unfortunately, I didn't write down his name, so I don't know. But the 4th Infantry was basically kind of the higher echelon who was in charge of getting the organizational infrastructure set up for our district headquarters detachment. They did set up a set of staff, this was the first DHD staff that was set up at Fort Missoula. And so there are these folks here would have been in charge of doing things like payroll, organizations, making sure supplies came on time, all of that kind of stuff. I'm going to actually flip to my notes. There we go. Yeah, so they had officers and administrators kind of organizing everything behind the scenes. They also hired local experienced men. They're also called LEMs, and they did specialty jobs. So even at Fort Missoula, we had things like movie operators, truck drivers, mail clerks, radio operators, things like this. For each, I don't know if you'll mention them later, the newspapers that the CCC camps started. There is so much information. This was 30 pages of text for this exhibit to give you an idea. But so each CCC camp did indeed create their own newspaper that they had amongst themselves. But Fort Missoula itself did have its own newspaper, the Green Guidon, and this is indeed the photo of the first editors and team, the first issue, and we actually have that in our collections at the museum, which is really neat. So not only do we have the influx of people, so the corpsmen that were coming in, as well as just trying to get all of those LEMs, the officers, the administrators, getting everything ready, they were also dealing with the changing of Fort Missoula as its infrastructure and its buildings as well. So one of the things that we were trying to do as part of the exhibit is figure out, okay, so which buildings at Fort Missoula had existed already, as well as which ones were being built specifically by the CCC men. So if you can see in the legend, the yellow buildings were the buildings that were used by the CCC and are still standing today. And the blue ones are the unfortunate ones that are no longer standing. But all of the other buildings were indeed used during that period from 1933 until 1942, the length of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So we have a couple... Okay, there we go. So basically, the fort was allotted thousands of dollars in WPA funds to try and fund some of the restructuring, rehabilitation to these buildings. One of the famous buildings that folks reminisce about is our lovely rec center, which did indeed play a lot of major pieces in the internment story of Fort Missoula's history, but was indeed built during the CCC era. And yet again, don't know if you'll mention it, but it was indeed the hosting site of the Golden Gloves boxing tournament. The CCC corpsmen were all about boxing. It was one of their favorite pastimes, and they held that tournament right here at the rec center at Fort Missoula for even just general Missoulians to attend during that time. So again, not only did Missoula see a lot of changes, Fort Missoula saw a lot of changes, they were also going out into Montana to set up those CCC camps. So Fort Missoula administered 24 to 32 camps each summer. And basically, they were trying to set up these camps that you see here. So Montana was part of the 9th Army Corps area, and so this also doubled as the administrative region for the CCC. Originally, Montana was approved for 25 camps in 1933. By the end of that, it's really hard to get a final number, but the number we currently have on record is 68 at the end, and these tended to ebb and flow in use and in various areas throughout the 9 years of existence. And to give you an idea, we had 68, and there were 4,500 camps throughout the country. So we only had a small portion of them, despite our landscape for them. So a typical camp is structured like that blueprint that you see there. They really were set up basically like miniature cities. They had everything from housing, food, health, educational, religious, entertainment facilities, everything you could imagine. And they kind of went through multiple phases. Obviously when the CCC first started and they were kind of scrambling for materials, equipment, and everything to get going, get those men out into the woods and get them working, they started with things like these tent camps that you see here. From there, they went to more rigid camps, kind of like the barrack-style buildings that you see down there, and then even to portable camps as well. So rigid camps were kind of the, let's actually build buildings that can withstand certain types of weather. As you can imagine, in Montana, tent camps did not last very long for many parts of the season. So these tent camps were either only used in the summer or were more regularly used in states that did not have our inclement weather in the winters. Once these rigid camps were set up, they could stay for longer, work for longer, which is sometimes more helpful in some of the projects they were working on. But portable camps were really what the Army wanted. They wanted to be able to go into an area, set up rigid buildings, and move them away once the work was done. So that was always the goal, and it took quite a few years for them to get there, unfortunately. But typically, each camp, no matter what type, whether it be tent or rigid, there were typically at least 24 buildings minimum at every single camp. And that would essentially facilitate the housing and lives of 200 men per site. So this, to give you an idea of those 68 camps, there are quite a few of them here in western Montana, and then they do spread out a little bit. We'll talk about a couple specific sites in just a second, but to give you an idea, this is one of the older maps that was actually pulled together by a historian in the 70s and 80s. We have actually expanded upon this map and used more data, and on the museum's website you can actually see a brand shiny new GIS map, which maps even more points than this, which is why the number is sometimes harder to nail down than I would hope. So some of these camps you can actually see remnants of to this day. So in preparation for this exhibit, I myself took a trek out to some of these locations to try and get a better sense of what it would have been like for those men during the 1930s to go and work in the CCC. So we're going to go through a couple here, but the first one we'll talk about is the Savanak Nursery in Haugen. I say it wrong every time, I'm so sorry. But this nursery was definitely one of the tent poles of western Montana's CCC camps. The original nursery was built in 1907, so it had been in operation prior to the CCC. But unfortunately, if we know our western Montana history, 1907 is right before the 1910 fires, exactly. And so a place like a tree nursery, especially that far west, very close to the Idaho border, it was devastated at that point in time. So basically, they were trying to recover the nursery when the CCC showed up. And the CCC ended up modernizing the facility that was heavily, heavily damaged. Basically, what they did is they helped to expand into the nursery into becoming the largest tree nursery in the Northwest. And at this nursery, they developed many tree nursery techniques that were then spread throughout the rest of the country and are still in use today. So a couple of these shots, obviously the ones in color, are from my recent trip last summer to go and see it. They have these absolutely gorgeously maintained buildings, and you can actually rent them and stay in them overnight. It's very exciting. In that top corner is what it was like really post, I think that photo is 1916, so right after the 1910 fire. And this is what Camp Taft in the bottom corner would have looked like set up. They actually set up their camp directly across the road from where the nursery is today. And the Camp Taft Mountain Chieftain was indeed their little newspaper that they set up. Another lovely collection of camps, also in that very far western Montana area near Alberton, were the 9 Mile camps. We say plural here because there were a couple camps within this area, and they kind of ebbed and flowed in a lot of interesting ways. So Stoney Creek was actually one of the first CCC camps that was set up in that area, and it was the largest CCC camp in the country. So as I had said, camps were typically set up for about 200 men, but this camp was actually an amalgamation of 2, sometimes 3 camps, and so they had 44 buildings in their camp and 500 men posted there at any given time. These men were indeed responsible for building the historic remount depot that you can still go see today, which then, kind of similar to the Savanak Nursery, became the largest mule ranch in the Northwest. After many years in that first Stoney Creek camp, they ended up removing some of those pieces, built a new camp called Camp Menard in the later years of the CCC. And this camp actually ended up hosting some smoke jumper training that you can see in the top right corner, as well as the traditional other CCC activities. So as part of this project and in our collection here, we do have a lot of these wonderful, really roster shots. This is not the best quality one, but this is indeed from one of the 9 Mile camps as well. And the last highlight here is one of my absolute favorites. It is a bear to get to, but if you can, I would highly suggest it. The Birch Creek Camp near Dillon in the Beaverhead National Forest is definitely a sight to behold. Basically, when this was in operation in the CCC, it was already kind of nicknamed the model camp. Every camp wanted to be modeled after this one, built in the same way, because it just offered the best facilities for the CCC men, despite the fact that they were there year-round, and the temperatures did plummet to negative 32 degrees in the winter. The potbelly stoves that they had in these buildings were very popular, as you can imagine. So they did indeed have about 200 men throughout the year at this Birch Creek camp, and they were doing everything from fighting fires, planting trees, building roads and campgrounds, all of that kind of stuff that Kristjana is going to expand upon. But the other lovely bit about the Birch Creek camp is it was actually nicknamed the University at Birch Creek. As part of the CCC program in their daily lives, they were offered many educational opportunities. They could take vocational training or just general classes to be able to reach different levels of schooling. And this particular camp ended up offering so many classes that they were the highest level of education of any camp throughout all of Montana. It was very exciting. So these color photos are from, again, when I went and visited last summer. So they are still in gorgeous condition, taken care of by volunteers. And they look pretty darn similar to that photo up above. And so I'm going to lead Kristjana to her section. So we've talked about Fort Missoula, what was happening there, the camps that they were setting up. But the part I slightly glossed over is that basically Fort Missoula was most men's, especially who were working in the 9th Army Corps region in the CCC. That was their first arrival. They were coming to Fort Missoula to get outfitted, to get trained, to have health exams, to get accustomed to the conditions that they were about to endure throughout the summer, potentially throughout the entire year. Kristjana will go over that. But basically, there were some folks who were city slickers, as it were, and did not understand the culture and climate of Montana. And they sure did indeed have to go through quite a bit of a regimen here to get used to it before being sent off. And I think that leads on to Kristjana.
Okay.
And I should say also, if anybody has questions at any point, Emma and I are just going to keep jumping back and forth. So feel free to flag us down if you have a question about anything in particular. Emma did most of the research, so she knows more than me, but we'll figure it out together. And also, we're giving a real overview here. There's so many great stories that are in the exhibit and more pictures and things that you can look at. So hopefully you guys will get a chance to come out. So just kind of going back to what Emma was talking about that sort of first couple days at Fort Missoula or at any of the starting points. Many people at this time, thinking back to the state of the economy and life in the U.S., they were coming into a place like Fort Missoula. A lot of them were undernourished or malnourished. A lot of folks had been, in a really bad place at home, and so they maybe were subsisting on cornmeal and beans. So one of the things they had to deal with at any of the CCC camps was just getting someone well enough and strong enough to be doing the work. And when you see later the examples of the things they accomplished, it's pretty amazing. Most people gained, like most of the men gained weight. They talked about getting stronger while they were there. So who could join the CCC? You had to be, yes?
So were they specifically trying to give them much better food than they got at home?
Yeah, I would say so. Uh-huh. Yep. And if you listen to the oral histories, people talk about they joined because of the 3 squares, 3 square meals a day. So, and they were able to get seconds and thirds of meals. I know there's some like the newsreels where FDR loved to visit the camps that were closest to him and sit down for a meal. So I'm sure those were like the extra special ones, but they were getting protein and vegetables and carbs, So they definitely, it was in the CCC's interest to feed them well enough so that they could do the work too.
It's really important. Although
It
I was
is.
a school teacher most of the year, I worked in the summer for farmers
Uh-huh.
and ranchers. And those meals, the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they were kept.
Yeah, I can imagine for sure. Probably as a school teacher, you also notice when the kids haven't had lunch yet. So to be able to join, you had to be a citizen of the United States, male, unemployed, and between the ages of 17 and 23. Now, at the beginning, they were pretty lenient about who was 17. So a lot of younger kids did join. And then later, because the World War I veterans were, upset that they weren't being able to do this, they did extend it to folks as old as 30, ancient, if they were a veteran. So you also had to be willing to spend 6 months away from your family, so that was your first enrollment period. You could sign on for more, but it was a 6-month commitment. As far as women go, there was a program that eventually got going. It was spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt, and it was part of the Federal Emergency Relief Association. So you guys get in the alphabet soup now. We got a lot of acronyms here. There were some camps between 1934 and 1937, so much shorter than the regular CCC. Now, people at the time didn't really think of women as being full economic participants in our economy, even though 2 million women had been working and lost their jobs. So a lot of women ended up homeless. But there was, just think about the time period and expectations on women. So some people didn't want them to go into the camps because they believed that they would get up to debauchery and it would be bad for them to be in a camp with other women. But eventually, they did have a set of camps that were more like you would think of summer camp. So not quite the hard labor that our regular CCC camps did, but a place where they could have some social interaction with women, learn new skills, have 3 meals a day, and recreation time. It was only for 4 weeks, but it was very well received by the women that went. And I have a quote from one woman who said, let's see if I started talking and lost my notes here, that not only, she said, not only am I getting enough to eat for the first time in 3 years, but I'm starting to think of myself as a real person again. So this kind of harkens back to FDR's sort of motivation for this whole thing. He did want economic relief, but he also realized that there was a need for morale boosting. So he wanted to get people back to work for as much of just having something to do and to feel useful. And that worked with the women as well. Yes?
Did the women get paid?
I don't know. Do you know? No, they didn't get paid. Yeah, so it was more of just like it was paid for them. They didn't have to pay anything to go to camp, but so people from, lower economic statuses could go do that. That's a good question, though. Oh, question I have for you, because I don't know the answer. Did they have weekends off at the regular CCC camps, or did they work 7 days a week? They had 1 day off a week. Okay, somebody asked me the other day, and I didn't know. So the other role that women had in the CCC camps is some women worked in the camps. We know specifically about a woman named, Glenna Moore. And we have, there's some great oral histories in the Mansfield collection that talk about this time period. And so she and her husband were academic advisors. And so all of those classes, like the Birch Creek University that Emma was talking about, were done by some of the local experienced folks. And she talked about having to figure out how to teach basic literacy to 16-year-olds. So that was something that I don't think they really understood going into the camps how much of sort of basic education they were going to have to cover. So she tried to help teach them things like being able to write well enough to sign their payroll and how to read as well as they could. And they especially liked comic books. So I think if you get a chance to check out the Green Guidance or any of the newspapers or books from the CCC, there's a lot of really hilarious not necessarily appropriate comic strips in there that I'm sure were enjoyed by the men in camp.
It was the pinup era.
Yes, yeah, just kind of, you can use your imagination there. So diversity in the CCC. So initially, the camps were integrated, but it was a very racist, very segregated time period, and so there was a lot of pushback to that. So then we ended up with camps that were for African Americans or for white folks. And then a separate camp for Native American people as well. So I know that the local camps that were run with Native Americans mostly worked on the reservation as far as infrastructure goes. Just as you might imagine, although the basics were the same, folks that were in the African American camps did complain that they were getting the worst equipment. They weren't getting like the top of the line stuff. And it was supposed to be a quota of enrollees based on population, but a lot of people noticed that at the time, even though the black population of the U.S. was about 10%, we weren't getting 10% of the CCC being African American. So, but I mean, you can read up there, it says, we have learned to write in the CCC, and so these folks are learning basic literacy skills through their time in the CCC. They got paid the same though, right? Yeah, okay. So back to just general daily life in the CCC. They had hard work to do every day, 3 meals a day, vaccinations for the first time, medical care. A lot of folks talk about having 2 pairs of shoes for the first time in their life. So basic, and a dentist, right? So things, all of this was covered for them. So even though they only got paid, they got to take 5 of those dollars of that 30. They did have, room and board and clothing and supplies taken care of for them. A typical day in the CCC, it was probably a lot like an Army schedule in that they had a bugle that woke them up in the morning and a one to tell them when the day had ended. But I suspect they had better food than we would get in the Army now, and a lot more recreation time. So you see their schedule there. They got up at 6, breakfast at 6:30, head out to lunch. You see where my brain is. Head out to work. Then they had a lunch break, and then they were back at camp, between 4 and 5. They did have to do bunk inspection, and the camps were run sort of like an Army boot camp in that way, which probably Emma will talk about later was probably helpful once World War II happened. They got supper, and then they got time for recreation and leisure before lights out. So what could you do for fun if you were a member of the CCC? So we're lucky we have some scrapbooks from some of the men that were at Fort Missoula or that came through the district. So we have pictures of things that they did. They did a lot of sports. I love this one. This one just says, after dinner frolics. So apparently that was on the menu there. They had baseball and basketball, and they had boxing, which we'll talk about a little bit more. they had time for art. They also had religious activities available to them as well. They had their newspaper. They had all kinds of fun stuff. Am I forgetting anything major? Okay, so we know a lot about life at in the CCC because of scrapbooks and documents and oral histories, and I was just going to highlight a couple of the people that we have their artifacts on display. So this is one of the discharge papers for Adam M. Rona. He started in the CCC in Ohio as basically a farm laborer in 1937 at the age of 17. Then he took some time for school and then rejoined in 1940 as a part of Company 544 in the Fort Missoula district. So while he was here at Fort Missoula, he worked on the rail lines, and that was the majority of his service. We don't know as much about him. Michael Lamola, he is our famous boxer. So and I think he was from Helena, right? There's a newspaper article that says that he's from Helena. He was in the CCC because his mom had 9 mouths to feed at home, so he wanted to help support his mother. He worked with the other corpsmen, just like the one we just talked about, on rail lines and things to do with the railroad. But the thing that really made his experience here special was that he was a boxer before he joined the CCC, and he had a chance to compete in competitions here, eventually winning the Golden Glove title at the rec center that we were talking about earlier in 1941. And we have pages from his scrapbook as well. And then another individual we know is Albert here. He graduated from with a degree in forestry, so a little bit different from the other enrollees we were talking about. He was hired by the CCC to supervise 5 companies based out of the Fort Missoula district, but he ended up in a spot that had a lot of good skiing. So he was out there learning how to ski, and while he was supervising all of his folks there. And he ended up with a long life ahead of him, where he lived in Wyoming and Montana and Colorado. He was a ski patroller, so he definitely learned that love of skiing here in Montana and went on to continue that. So it's interesting to see like the impact, how many of these men who ended up with a love for the outdoors might not have gotten that if they hadn't been sent to the CCC. Yes?
I would think that because the Army was running this when World War II broke out, that perhaps they might enlist at a higher rate than the general.
I think so, Lee, and you might be jumping the gun. We might talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, no, that's a good call. Another person that we know about, he's a little near and dear to our heart because he is the great-grandfather of one of our former interns who's currently a graduate student at and a volunteer. This is Orville Casper Rude. He was originally from Three Forks. He went all the way through 8th grade in Laurel, Montana, and then was done with school. And he ended up coming through Fort Missoula and worked probably in forestry and mechanics for the CCC. He only did 6 months with us, but then he had a career in truck driving and mechanics, probably based on the skills that he honed here at Fort Missoula. And yeah, there's a picture of him with a dog, which is always fun. So we talked about the people, we talked about what camp was like, Emma talked a little bit about some of our satellite camps, but what were they doing here? So they're basically, the CCC really spearheaded government conservation as we know it, and sort of this institutional conservation that became a part of our country. So they did things like firefighting and preparation. We've got our 9-mile picture here, and also a fire lookout, which is terrifyingly much higher than the one that we have at Fort Missoula. So all in all, the CCC as a whole, nationally, that's what our numbers from on the sign are, right? Yep. They built more than 3,160 fire lookouts within that 9-year period. And let's see if I can get it to go. They built roads, laid telephone lines, and water lines. So they were also responsible for more than almost 7,000 stream constructions. And let me see my statistic on, where's my nothing about that one. I don't know. A whole bunch of telephone lines, because I can't find my statistic there, and something like 5,000 miles of water lines. So, and this is nationally, but it's just the amount of labor that happened during this 9-year period is amazing. They built trails, cabins, and recreation. So Emma talked about how when they first got situated at Fort Missoula, they were out increasing access to Patty Canyon and also the Rattlesnake Wilderness. Was it Marshall Mountain that they built? Or it was a precursor, a ski area in that area. And probably many of you, if you've recreated in Montana, or even I met somebody the other day whose favorite cabin in Arkansas was a CCC cabin. So there are cabins and infrastructure and roads and bridges in Glacier that are all products of CCC labor.
And that right there is the Lolo Pass cabin that still exists today.
Oh, yeah.
You can drive right past it.
Nice. And they worked in Packer Meadows. There was all kinds of projects up there, too. Has anybody been to Lewis and Clark Caverns? Yeah, so that is all CCC. Okay, hold on a second. Just a few more fun statistics before I let Emma take over again. So, all in all, in the nation, they contributed 6,111,258 man-days of nursery work, so working in trees, building or growing trees and things. They created more than 4,000 fish ponds. They planted 45 million trees and shrubs, built 28,000 miles of horse and foot trails, harvested 13 million pounds of tree seeds. And this is the one that's near and dear to my heart. 405,037 signs, markers, and monuments, being the museum person there. So, all right, I will leave it over to you now.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about here is kind of the what happened exactly as you astutely pointed out. So the CCC started in 1933, and which is coming real close to a big old global conflict, World War II. So World War II did come calling. That is indeed FDR giving the announcement that we were joining the war. So basically, as it happens, I'm going to actually read my notes here. They essentially began shifting their attention away from doing home front economic relief, which was what the CCC was really built for, and really started to try and shift even as early as 1940, so before we were actually part of the war. They were trying to change some of the educational policies for the Cs in order to include some more of those skills and training that would help guide them on their path to the Army. So this would ensure that subjects such as radio operating, welding, machine and auto maintenance and mechanics, and clerking really became the focal point for those vocational trainings that were offered. So basically, the Cs was being transformed into more of a training and defense agency rather than teaching conservation skills and providing economic relief. So all conservation work done by the Cs was officially canceled on January 1st, 1942. Basically, the declaration of war drained the main manpower for the Cs, which was happening over time slowly. Basically, less and less people were enrolling even prior to the conflict breaking out because the economy was doing better. So less people needed the relief program, and so they could actually start joining the workforce. And then once war were declared, as they say, they were able to, or they were starting to enlist there rather than the Cs. So, but basically, having lived in a very Army-regulated program, training schedule, all of that kind of thing, these men really were primed and ready to join the men who were being sent overseas. Basically, without the training and groundwork that the Cs had laid, exactly right, America would not have been able to as effectively fight in the war as we were able to. What do I have it on here? No? Okay, so we'll stick here for a second. But obviously that meant that Fort Missoula also changed at this time. So Fort Missoula, as we've kind of hinted at and we mentioned at the beginning, became the alien detention center, so internment camp for the Italians and the Japanese for most of World War II. And basically, by that time, even though it was running a very successful district headquarters detachment, the INS started buying Fort Missoula to become that alien detention center. Basically, it had enough existing infrastructure, kind of similar to the C's, that they could take advantage of without having to do a lot of front-end work. So obviously, this meant that once the CCC was voted out of existence, camps around western Montana were immediately dismantled and supplies were sent across the state as well as directly to the military to help support those efforts. But that really doesn't mean that's the end of the CCC story, because what we have here is the long-term legacy that was left behind by the C's. We tried to break this down kind of into 4 groups. So as an enrollee, the legacy that you might have is that you would not only be provided the financial stability that the Depression and the stock market crash and all of those pieces had kind of deprived you of. You now had that ability, especially if you were sending money home, being able to save. A lot of corpsmen were actually able to save their money and attend college after their service. And they also received that vocational training, which yet again allowed them to quickly join the workforce and be able to kind of effectively assist the economy in that way. We've talked, those statistics are some of my favorite. There is a rolling slideshow in the exhibit that just goes through those astronomical numbers of the things that they created. But basically, one of the biggest things was national parks and national forests really weren't a thing prior to the C's, at least not in the same way that they are today. So the C's really changed the entire recreational patterns for the country. They created these open spaces that were well-maintained campgrounds, picnic areas, trails all over the country that we can still see and exist today. Folks around the country are using these places that were indeed put into place 90 years ago. And sometimes you won't know it unless you're like a Kristjana or myself, who reads every single plaque and marker that is along the way. And you may indeed see, oh, this one was created by this camp in the CCC. And obviously, as we've already talked about, this was kind of the first time that folks in America were able to start thinking about this idea of land conservation and preservation. It provided the foundation to those practices of ethics for those that are even still used today. Basically, the Dust Bowl happened, and suddenly this work allowed there to be a break in the misuse of the land, and now there were 3 million men who knew how to take care of the forests, the land, and even their own farmland in their own home areas. So that meant that the kind of healing and regrowth could happen long term and continue on to modern environmentalism as we know it today. But basically, as you can imagine, going from soul-crushing depression and really hard times, and then finding this program that allowed you to create that financial stability, improved national morale. So this program, whether you were in the C's or watching it happen, it allowed folks to start feeling better about the country and kind of as a whole, and ended up truly staving off some pretty scary civil unrest that could have happened should this type of program not been in place. So there are some organizations that are kind of keeping this legacy alive even past. Our exhibit is sadly temporary, so we rely on places like these to kind of keep this story alive. So we have CCC Legacy, as Kristjana already mentioned, and this nonprofit, which is actually based out of Virginia, which is where the very first CCC camp ever was installed. They are actually just a nonprofit who is collecting stories, artifacts, and histories about people who were in the CCC throughout the country. They have a wealth of information and resources on their website. It is absolutely amazing, and we are hoping to partner with them at some point during the future. They've come to the Fort Missoula to do a reunion. I think it was in 2011 or something like that. Yeah, right. Close enough. But yeah, so they are doing a lot of that work to keep the legacy truly alive. Our neighbor, even at Fort Missoula, at the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History, they are actually housed in some of the CCC era buildings that were built during the 1930s, and they still maintain those buildings today. They have one of their buildings that they're trying to adapt into a permanent installation about the seas, which is really exciting. But for those who are doing boots on the ground work, the Montana Conservation Corps here in the state are the ones sending kiddos out to do essentially similar work. So we already brought up the Lewis and Clark Caverns. So the Lewis and Clark Caverns were a major project for the seas, and the MCC was able to go back and revitalize a lot of the trails, stairs, and other essentially support systems within that space as one of their very first projects as well, which was a lovely way to kind of circle back around onto history. So they have been doing this since 1990, and they are still at it today. But there we go. Unless you have anything else to say, Kristjana.
No, but happy to answer questions. Yeah, Robert.
Was there like, when you signed up, I know you had to be willing at least 6 months, but was there a definite term you signed up for?
It was a 6-month term, and then you could
Yeah, so basically you had to agree to be there for 6 months. If you tried to leave prior, you either had to get some kind of essentially release due to like a family emergency or something like this. But then you were usually expected to come back to finish your term, if at all possible. Otherwise, you finished your 6 months and you could actually re-enroll for up to 2 years total. Yeah. Paulette?
I'm curious, my grandfather worked at a CCC camp in Sheridan County, Montana, which you did not have marked on your map. He helped build Carroll Dam to get water more available to the communities out there. And then just south of Freud, there are terraced fields, and those terraced fields have Russian olive trees separating them, trying to stop the blowing topsoil. Where can you find more information about those projects? Because I'd like to find out what my grandpa actually did. He went to the dam and shoveled with a shovel.
Yeah, so yeah, you are hitting exactly on what made part of this project so difficult, is that the CCC legacy, for example, does have a pretty extensive list of camps in each state, but it uses some of the vernacular that the Army, we're all used to seeing Army documents that have those abbreviations and code numbers and stuff that we don't necessarily know, but they reference things like forest reclamation, drought relief, all of that kind of stuff. But the on-the-boots groundwork is harder to identify unless we can find those pieces like the newsletters and newspapers that the camps themselves had. Unfortunately, those got spread to the winds. So what we tried to do as part of this exhibit is try to identify all of the spots where SEAS camps happened in Montana. Like I said, that was an early map from the 70s and 80s. Ours has a lot more points on it. And we were able to, there was a Bill Sharp, who some of you folks might actually know. He had just binders of amazing information, as well as some of their old yearbooks, which listed some of those projects. So on our website, we essentially transcribed those yearbooks into a kind of digital database. It is only for, I think, 12 camps, so it doesn't cover everything, but that's what we have so far. And our goal through this exhibit was trying to get folks who had those experiences, who have those physical artifacts, who can come in and help us. Without those like on the firsthand accounts, it's very hard to see that or understand that. We have some great photos of them doing stuff in various camps, but it's harder to pull together, and we sure wish we had those answers for you, Paulette.
He was older too, because he was born in '93, but he had like 6 kids already, maybe 7, and a few more to come later. But so that a 30 age is not quite.
He would have been a little bit older, yeah.
Was he a veteran?
Not that I've ever been able to find. All of his boys were, but he was not.
Yeah, so veterans, usually they were a lot more flexible on age, especially for veterans. It is also sometimes the older folks were actually the ones who were hired as those local experienced men. So rather than being a true corpsman who would have just applied and gone through all that rigmarole, they actually got hired, which, so for example, our Albert Demarest, who is on here, he was actually hired as one of those supervisors. So again, that may have been the case, and they did definitely start to recognize when folks needed help. So, you know.
Younger days, he actually laid pipe in Minot, North Dakota for their first water.
Yeah.
So definitely could have been.
Right, yeah, that makes sense then, yeah.
Had experience, had a knowledge, and was able to maybe help in that process. I think they did. Unfortunately, I don't have my notes on that part. But because they were not necessarily just the traditional corpsmen, they had that kind of higher knowledge or education base. Usually, yes, but it really depended on the location, the job they were doing, etc.
Yeah, we can follow up with you, Paulette, too, with the links to the other map and what we have.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm just curious, I mean, they built rail lines and telephone lines. Was there any corporate reimbursement to the government?
Ooh, that one I actually do not know. I could imagine, but that would have been something the Army would have had to work out with the government and with the private sector that unfortunately I did not find any details on. So that's a good one. I know especially for the telephone lines, a lot of those were being laid for the Park Service or the Forest Service. So it was more through yet another governmental agency rather than private sector. The rail lines are a bit more tricky for that reason, but I know at least the telephone lines they were probably more just put in a different bucket rather than something that needed to be reimbursed, essentially.
Any other questions?
All I have to say is that if you guys do get a chance to come by, I literally hand sewed a replica of one of the pyramid tents that I am so very proud of, and I just want everyone to be able to see it because it is very exciting. So especially if you have grandkiddos or students or anyone who you think would be interested, it's just a fun time to crawl into one of those. So definitely a great place. Go ahead, Robert.
At one slide you showed of the watchtower. Is that Slide Rock?
Was not Slide Rock. The photo, unfortunately, again, I don't have it listed in my notes here, but it is, we do actually know which one it is, and that one is in the exhibit, so there is a little label. So next time you're at the museum doing some volunteer, you can take a look.
Yeah, I'll also show you, we have a virtual exhibit too. We'll see if I can get it to, are we on the internet, Maria? Will this work? Okay. Oh, here we go. So if you can't get out, or if you get out and you just want to know more about it, we'll see if we can get it to load there. We have a virtual walkthrough. So I can show you the tent. It's not gonna, this is the inside the tent here. You can see about that. But you can also see like all of the little bits. I'm gonna go over if I can.
Oh, and as a note, just because I love to say it, that artwork that we had at the beginning of the presentation that you just saw on the wall there was actually done by a local artist. So it is not an artifact, but instead an inspiration of Fort Missoula's history, as well as kind of that Art Deco period that was very popular in the time. And it is one of my favorite art pieces ever.
So yeah, you can go on our website and you can look at pictures. And I was thinking that maybe we could look at that one picture. Yeah, we borrowed a lot from
Stan Cohen has quite a collection of photos because he did indeed write a lovely book called The Tree Army.
Yes.
If you guys have not read it, definitely give it a read. And so a lot of the photos that he was able to use are indeed through like National Archives and other places like this. But it's definitely one to look at.
So that lookout is from Beaver Ridge Lookout. And it was the folks that were out in Packer Meadow on Lolo Pass that built that behemoth. But it does look a lot like, it looks like an L4. Like
It is an L4, I'm pretty sure.
So yeah, okay. Well, we'll stick around for a little bit if anybody wants to come up and chat. But thank you guys for coming. Thanks for not having Leif here today.
Thank you for letting us stand in.